International leaders are urging restraint over fears the violence between Israel and Hamas will escalate into a full-scale war. Israel has killed several commanders of the militant unit. Palestinian militants fired over 1,000 rockets aimed at cities across southern Israel. This marks the heaviest fighting between Israel and Hamas since 2014. Unrest and riots have now also spread across Arab-populated towns in Israel and parts of the occupied West Bank. And we've invited two individuals who have played a role in trying to bring peace to the region. First, Nizar Farsakh. He's advised senior Palestinian leaders, including President Mahmoud Abbas. He was a member of the peace negotiation team of the Palestinian Liberation Organization between 2003 and 2008, and he joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much. And I just really want to begin with, when you see what is unfolding, not just between Hamas and the Israeli military, but between Arabs and Jewish citizens of Israel on the streets. What do you make of it?
Well, it's a very big. Well, first, thank you for having me, and thank you for having Danny. Danny's a good friend of mine. We were together in the negotiations. I am very concerned. This is a serious escalation. The sense of fear and threat is very palpable. There has been incitement in radical Jewish Israeli circles wanting to storm the holy sites in Jerusalem, as well as the issues in Sheikh Jarrah. So the whole sense on the Palestinian side is that there is a clear and present danger, and that the Palestinian leadership is incapable of protecting them. So let's remember that this escalation started with the attacks on Sheikh Jarrah, and how the Palestinian Jerusalemites trying to protect their houses and trying to protect Palestinian families from being evicted. This is the rocket attacks are definitely a serious escalation. The fact that Mohammed Deif, the senior military commander of Hamas that has been silent for over 7 years, has spoken, indicates that it's a serious escalation. At the same time, we have an Israeli prime minister who everybody knows is trying to avoid conviction for bribery charges, is looking for a way out, and war is a great way. He's good at war, and this is a great opportunity for him to distract from his own domestic issues.
So, Nizar, I want to ask you that because, of course, there are many lives that are at stake, and lives have already been lost on both sides here. What is, in your mind, what is the chance that this becomes something much bigger soon?
The chances are very high, and what you alluded to, the attacks in mixed cities, Arab Israeli or Arab Jewish cities like Haifa, Lid, and Jaffa, are very concerning. It shows that there are tensions everywhere, and the radical elements or the radical factions in Israel feel emboldened and protected. Not different from the situation in the US, where African Americans feel threatened, and the police does very little to protect them while they protect white Americans. It's a similar simmering situation.
I am struck when you talk about leadership. I am also thinking about the divisions within Palestinian society itself. Not every Palestinian, of course, will support Hamas, and even those who do will not necessarily support Hamas firing rockets at this point. And as we have this sort of tit-for-tat continuation of responses, I also look to the West Bank, where the Palestinian leader canceled elections. What is the role of leadership, or a gap in leadership playing here?
I would call it a dearth, actually, not even a gap, a dearth of leadership across the board on all sides. Definitely, there was the cancellation of the elections was a big disappointment. Palestinians wanted elections for a very long time, and the fact that they got canceled further reinforced the feeling that the Palestinians are on their own. The leadership is absent, or at the very least incompetent or incapable of supporting. So people are resorting to their own devices. And at the same time, this is coming with a very right-wing Israeli government and a general Israeli political sentiment that's very right-wing, that feels emboldened by the successes or like the victories, quote unquote, that they got from the Trump administration. So when you look at the incitement for 30,000 Jewish radicals to march to Jerusalem, you understand that from their perspective, it's an opportunity for them to grab whatever they can grab now while the Palestinians are down, and that's, I think, the source of the dearth of leadership, that nobody's telling people what they need to hear as opposed to what they want to hear.
I am hearing your calls, I think, for the Israeli military to limit its responses as we see the situation continuing to worsen. Do you believe it is important for Hamas to stop the rocket attacks?
I do. And I don't think it's the Israeli military that needs to do something. I think it's the Israeli politicians that need to stand down and tell people that whether we like them or not, the Palestinians are here to stay, and we're going to need to find a way to give them their rights and make sure that their rights are respected and are safe. And likewise, Hamas. And the challenge with Hamas is, as I said, because the Palestinians feel threatened and feel that their leadership is not delivering, the attacks that Hamas the rocket attacks are getting results with the Israelis, as in the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court or the Israeli court postponed its decision on the eviction of the Jerusalemites. So from the Palestinian perspective, they are seeing results from the rockets more than results from diplomacy, unfortunately. And that's what we need to correct. We need diplomacy to get results and not violence to get results.
Nizar Farsakh, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now for the view from a former Israeli peace negotiator. Daniel Levy served as an advisor to the Israeli government, the one led by Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and was a member of the Israeli delegation at the Taba peace talks back in 2001. He is in London. Mr. Levy, thank you very much for joining us in what is your evening. I wonder, how would you characterize the significance of the escalation that we're now seeing unfold?
I think it's quite significant, and I think it's quite significant for a few reasons. First of all, and I think this is partly explaining just how significant an Israeli counter-response there is likely to be. The Israelis had started to get into a space where they thought, especially during the Trump years, the Palestinian issue is laid to rest. We can manage it. It's low cost. We're getting peace with more of the Arab neighbors. And so this has come as a totally predictable and unsurprising, but nevertheless in that Israeli bubble, I think something of a nasty surprise. I think it's significant because of the nature of the escalation, that Hamas has managed to send Israelis across much of the country into shelters. It's significant because of the events in Jerusalem, which preceded this, where Israel really provoked and stoked the fires there, which led to this round in terms of planned home evictions, very heavy-handed policing, which is recognized and has been criticized across much of the Israeli commentariat, and unified the Palestinians around the issue of Jerusalem. And perhaps of really major importance, and perhaps less commented on, is what's going on inside Israel itself, where you're having some very ugly incidents between groups of mostly young Palestinian Israeli citizens and young Jewish citizens of Israel. Now, in this evening, you've seen an escalation where you've had really gangs of Jewish youths, extremists, intentionally coming to Arab areas and attacking Arab-owned properties and shops.
I'm curious, Mr. Levy, when you speak about the Israeli counter-response and how significant, and I'm going to use the word large, you anticipate it will be. I wonder what you see the role of Israel to do what it can to ensure proportionality in responding, or does Israel, which has said it has a right to self-defend, and others like the U.S. and Germany have backed that right, but there is a question around proportionality.
Well, it's a very important issue you raise. Of course, firing rockets at civilians is in violation of international law, and Hamas is rightly called out on that. What is also in violation of international law and has in fact led to a case already standing before the International Criminal Court, is a disproportionate response. And what I think we have seen consistently, and unfortunately, I think we're seeing it again on this occasion, is an Israel with a far too low a bar for what is considered an okay target for Israel's highly precise and highly sophisticated weapons, something that, of course, is not in the possession of the Palestinians, which has consistently, and again this time as well, led to significant Palestinian civilian casualties, including children. And the worry is that in the coming days, in that desire to have the victory photo, in that desire to inflict pain on the other side, you will see an increasing tally of Palestinians, that the numbers are already getting high. It's several dozen. And those numbers could really go up, especially, and this is not a given at the moment in which we're speaking, David, but especially if there is a ground incursion.
Yeah, and what I was about to ask about that. What do you think the odds are of a ground invasion by the Israelis into Gaza?
Well, thankfully, I'm not a bookmaker, and if I was, I probably wouldn't be posting odds on this kind of an issue. But you do see Israeli forces beginning to amass. It's apparently, and this is only reporting that we're hearing, apparently under consideration. It's not happened as of us speaking, and the Israelis know that if they do go in, then this is where their own military losses could escalate. Of course, they're not going to go anywhere near the casualties that we will almost certainly see on the Palestinian side. So it's a decision that is not one that they rush into. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that Israel doesn't have a declared goal coming out of this, other than the rather hard to tie down thing that is called restoring deterrence. So Israel has not stated it as its goal to remove Hamas, who would go in their place, to put another Palestinian in charge, to themselves go back in charge, which really begs the question, why are we back here? Why has the period of quiet not been used in order to end the blockade of Gaza, in order to allow Palestinian life to breathe in Gaza? And we've kept it at this level of tension where another development like this was inevitable. And of course, it's not just Gaza, it's the broader question of an occupation, a Palestinian people denied statehood, denied freedom, and denied rights, which is always going to lead to pushback.
We've got less than a minute here, Mr. Levy, but I would just also point out and ask you to put it in the context of what's going on in Israel right now, where you have essentially a caretaker government, but it's also combined with the intensity and of everything related to the pandemic, cancellation of elections in the West Bank. How do you see that playing into the context of what's transpiring now?
Sure. Palestinian elections should be taking place in a few days. Terrible those got cancelled. The world should not have sat by. That should have been encouraged. It wasn't. Shameful. In Israel, and I'll leave you with this thought, the prime minister, the longest serving ever Israeli prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, seemed on his way out. It seemed a coalition of other parties, a very hybrid coalition, was on the precipice of being formed. This may be a way for him to stay in power. It makes it difficult for that hybrid coalition to be formed. If this goes on, this may be Netanyahu, a man on trial, his ticket for political and perhaps even personal survival in terms of his get out of jail card, in the very literal sense of the term.
Mr. Levy, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.